Genesis 10, verse 1 to 32. Commentary. Genesis 10 is often called the Table of Nations. It traces the descendants of Noah's three sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem, and shows how humanity spread across the earth after the flood. At first glance, this chapter appears to be little more than a list of names, but it serves an important purpose in the unfolding story of Scripture. The chapter begins by showing that all nations have a common origin. The peoples of the earth did not arise independently, they came from one family. This emphasizes the unity of the human race. Though cultures, languages, and kingdoms would eventually differ, all people share the same ancestry through Noah and ultimately through Adam. The descendants of Japheth are associated with regions that spread outward into distant coastlands and territories. Their expansion demonstrates the fulfillment of God's command for humanity to fill the earth. The nations were not random developments, but part of the divine purpose for populating the world. The line of Ham includes several significant nations and kingdoms. Among these descendants is Nimrod, described as a mighty hunter and kingdom builder. His rise highlights humanity's growing tendency to establish power, authority, and centralized rule apart from dependence upon God. The cities connected with Nimrod later become important locations in biblical history, often representing human pride and self-exaltation. Many of the descendants of Ham become nations that later interact with Israel throughout the Old Testament. The mention of these peoples demonstrates that God was aware of all nations long before they entered the biblical narrative in greater detail. Nothing in history unfolds outside his knowledge and purpose. The descendants of Shem receive particular attention because from this line would eventually come Abraham. The genealogy narrows toward the family through whom God's covenant promises would be revealed. While Genesis 10 surveys the nations broadly, it is also preparing the reader for the covenant story that follows. The repeated references to lands, languages, clans, and nations show that humanity was becoming organized into distinct people groups. This development anticipates the events of the next chapter, where the confusion of languages at Babel is explained. Genesis 10 presents the result, while Genesis 11 explains how that result came about. From a covenantal perspective, this chapter demonstrates that God has always been concerned with all nations, not merely one ethnic group. The later calling of Abraham was never intended to exclude the rest of humanity, but to provide the means through which blessing would eventually reach every nation of the earth. Throughout Scripture, the promise given to Abraham expands until it finds its fulfillment in the work of Christ. The dividing walls that once separated peoples are removed as people from every tribe, language, and nation are brought together in one new humanity. The genealogies of Genesis 10 remind us that all nations share a common origin and ultimately find their unity in God's redemptive purpose. The chapter also provides an important backdrop for understanding the fulfillment of God's plan in the first century. The nations listed here became the peoples among whom the gospel spread. What began as scattered families after the flood culminated in the proclamation of the good news throughout the known world. The gathering of people from every nation into the kingdom demonstrates the accomplishment of the promises that had been developing since the earliest chapters of Genesis. Thus, Genesis 10 is more than a record of ancient ancestry. It reveals God's sovereign oversight of history, his concern for all peoples, and his purpose to unite humanity through the covenant blessings that would ultimately reach the nations. The chapter stands as a testimony that history is not a collection of disconnected events, but the unfolding of God's plan from one generation to another, until his purposes are fully realized.